You see, my history goes back to shackles, nooses, and religious facts. My history goes back to a time where they murdered their own just for affiliating with us. They said we were supposed to stay in the back. My history goes back to a time when we were getting gas with no mask. My history goes back to a time where we couldn't attend school or vote, and yes, a massa. Better been your only response you gave back. My history goes back to hiding in woods from white people wearing white hoods that covered their face almost like a cage instead of a hat. Yeah, my history goes back. Slave ships obeying masters. Oh, said that wrong. I mean, being on slave ships, or better yet, being slave shipped and obeying masters and a bruised back that's been lashed at. I said my history goes back to being branded, castrated, and walked on like floor mats. My history goes back to being nonviolent while being hit with violent political straps. My history goes back to segregation, separate bathrooms, and fire hose stats. My history goes back inequality, struggling and pushing through this and that. My history goes back to them killing our babies, raping our women, and our men caused to fight or die just because they're black. Like I said, my history goes back to first inventions, first attributes, and never getting credit for that. Like I said before, my history goes back to remembrance that. My history goes back to remember that. My history goes back. I remember that. Old Negro spirituals and hymnals gave you strength to know if you trust in the Lord, He'll be the bone in your back when you can't stand. He'll carry you if you can't crawl. He'll be your ram in the bush when you need a stall. And when the enemy send traps, he'll open doors for you and put up walls like brick stacks versus the other walls. Similar to in a nursery rhyme, the three little pigs found. Sound familiar? When the big bad wolf came to attack, my history goes back to Ephesians. My history goes back to Pharaoh letting my people go. My history goes back to Genesis. My history goes back. My history goes back. My high story. I mean my his story. I mean my history goes back to before there was an African American. My history goes back to the nigga I was called before I was called the color girl or color boy, to later be called a Negro. Yeah, my history goes back. My high story is that his story kept me even when their story tried to erase that. My history goes back to when I was just plain old black. And even though Black History Month is over, does that take away from the fact that I still remain black? So summed up in 4 little but most powerful words, my history goes back.